I never thought I'd be the guy who lost his mind in his own living room, but that's exactly who I became the night I came back early from a business trip and found my wife, the woman I'd built 10 years of my life with, naked in our bed with another man while live streaming it for strangers online. It's one thing to cheat, it's another thing to rub someone's face in it like that. I've always had anger issues, I know that. I grew up with fists before words, and my therapist used to say I had a fight response dialed up to max. Most days I can keep it down, push it into work, workouts, whatever. But that night, no chance. I unlocked the door quietly because I wanted to surprise her, maybe even cook dinner. Instead, I heard moaning, laughter, and a man's voice that wasn't mine echoing down the hall. My chest burned like acid. I pushed the bedroom door open and there she was, my wife, on all fours with a camera propped up on my nightstand, her eyes glazed in ecstasy while some skinny piece of shit with tattoos grinned at the screen. She didn't even notice me at first, too busy performing for her faceless audience. And me? I snapped. I didn't scream right away. I laughed. A sick, broken laugh that made them both look up, and when her eyes locked on mine, she froze. Then, this is what made me see red, she had the audacity to roll her eyes, like I was the one interrupting. Oh, for F***'s sake, Mark, you weren't supposed to be home until Sunday, she spat, voice sharp, annoyed, not guilty. My hands shook so hard I thought I'd break them. What the hell is this? I barked, though it was obvious. The guy just smirked, leaned back on my pillows, and said, looks like your girl needed a real man. That sentence was the detonator. I don't even remember moving. I just remember my fist connecting with his jaw, the crunch, his grunt, the camera falling sideways to the carpet, still streaming God knows what. My wife screamed, not in horror for me, not for our marriage, but for him. Stop it, Mark. You're going to ruin everything. Ruin everything? As if it wasn't already in pieces. As if my life wasn't being broadcasted to strangers like some freak show. I grabbed the camera, yanked it out of the socket, and smashed it against the wall. My chest was heaving, my vision narrowing. I knew I was losing control, I knew I was seconds away from crossing a line I couldn't come back from, but I couldn't stop myself. How long? I demanded, spit flying. How many times did you let this trash touch you in my bed? She didn't answer. She just folded her arms across her chest, still naked, and sneered, maybe if you weren't so controlling, I wouldn't need someone else to make me feel alive. The words sliced through me like glass. I lunged at the guy again, grabbed him by the throat. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a choke. My wife pulled at my arm, nails digging into my skin, screaming at me to let him go, and I knew I should. I knew if I didn't stop right then the cops would end up in my living room, but my rage was an animal that didn't listen to reason. I slammed him against the dresser hard enough to rattle the mirror, my own reflection flashing back at me wild-eyed, monstrous, unrecognizable. That's when the sick realization hit, I wasn't just the victim in this mess. I was becoming the villain. But even knowing that, I couldn't loosen my grip. Not yet. The guy's face was turning red under my hand, his eyes bulging, and for a split second I thought about just finishing it, snapping his damn neck and letting the world call me what I already felt like, a monster. But I forced myself to shove him down instead, and he collapsed against the dresser, coughing and wheezing. My wife pushed me back hard, her nails scratching across my arm, and screamed, what the hell is wrong with you? You're insane, Mark. You've always been insane. Like I was the problem. Like me walking in on her cheating in my bed, in my house, wasn't the real crime here. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I pointed at her, my hand shaking. Don't you dare flip this on me. Don't you fing dare. She laughed then laughed like she was above me, like I was some pathetic dog snapping at her heels. What did you expect, she said, dripping venom. You're so damn aggressive, always on edge, always acting like you own me. I got sick of it. At least she pointed to the guy still coughing on the floor, knows how to treat a woman without turning everything into a battlefield. That broke something inside me. My vision went red. Treat a woman? I spat. He's using you like some thing OnlyFans prop, and you're proud of it? That's what you call being treated right? The guy finally found his voice, wiping blood from his lip with a smirk. Better than being with a psycho like you, man. No wonder he didn't get to finish. My fist crashed into his mouth before the words were out, sending him sprawling across the floor with a sickening thud. My knuckles split, blood dripping, but I didn't care. I wanted him to suffer. I wanted her to feel the same humiliation she'd just dumped on me. My wife shrieked and slapped me across the face so hard my ears rang. You're pathetic, Mark. Do you hear yourself? You're ing animal. And the worst part? She was right. I was an animal in that moment. I could feel the rage controlling me more than I was controlling it. I wanted to stop, but my body wouldn't listen. It was like years of swallowed anger had finally erupted, and now I was drowning in it. I grabbed the lamp off the nightstand and hurled it at the wall, glass exploding across the carpet. You destroyed us. I roared, my voice breaking. 10 years. For what? Some live stream? Some loser who couldn't even look me in the eye without pissing himself? She didn't flinch. She just stood there, chin high, defiant. 10 years of walking on eggshells around your temper, Mark. 10 years of waiting for you to snap. Congratulations, you finally did. You're showing the whole world exactly who you really are. The silence after her words was louder than any fight we'd ever had. I could feel my chest caving in, my hands trembling, and for a second I wanted to drop to my knees and beg her to stop, beg her to take it back. But then I looked at the guy on the floor, his blood staining my carpet, and the camera still smashed in the corner, and I knew there was no going back. She had made me into a monster, and I had let her. I remember the moment like a burn scar, every second pressed into my head with the cruel clarity of something that will not heal. After the lamp shattered and the air smelled sharp with ozone and dust, she didn't move to comfort me or apologize. She crossed her arms and looked like she'd been waiting for a show the entire time. "You always do this," she said, voice cold as a slab. "Flip the script, smash things, act like you're stopping the world when actually you're just breaking furniture and making excuses." The man on the floor groaned and tried to get up, wiping his mouth with shaking fingers. "You should go," I said to him, voice low and steady in a way I'd never heard it be. He laughed, a wet sound, and pushed himself up. "Oh, I will," he said. "After I finish what we were doing." My hands curled into fists before my brain had permission to protest. It was like a third muscle had grown in my forearm, a muscle that decided faster than me. I hit him again, this time harder, and my knuckles slammed into his cheek with a bone crunch I felt in my teeth. He went down like a puppet whose strings were cut. She screamed, an animal sound of surprise and something like anger, and then she did the worst thing possible, she smirked. "You're really going to fight for that?" she mocked. "For me? For this marriage?" Rage is a compass that never points true north, it points to the nearest wound. I felt something inside me break and rearrange into sheer, stupid preservation. "You made this bed," I said, and the words were an apology and a verdict. "You lay in it." She laughed again, loud and scornful, but then, because she is nothing if not a master of turning the knife, she stepped forward until she was inches from my face and whispered, "You know what's funny? I tried to tell you. I told you I wanted more. You treated it like a confession instead of an invitation. You think you're the only one who ever felt trapped? Fuck you. You don't get to own the narrative and then act surprised when I write in margins." Those words landed like a slap with the authority of someone who'd spent years practicing cruelty. My chest hammered. I knew, intellectually, how this looked from the outside, how witnesses would describe the man in his 30s, shirtless, busted lamp in the background, blood on the carpet, his wife standing like a victor. I knew my profile, volatile, dangerous, the sort of man who had once been pulled out of bars and told to calm down. I've been trying to be better. I've been on medication, I've sat in chairs across from therapists who offered me tools and breathing exercises and phrases that were supposed to slow the panic. But medicine is a lever and only works if you pull it down before the weight tips. This time the weight had already fallen and I had no hand on the handle. Something inside me wanted to take her and shake every lie out of her, to make her feel tiny the way she'd made me small for 10 years. Another part of me, the part that lived in the quiet mornings and the late-night washing of dishes, wanted to crawl into a hole and never be seen. I couldn't decide which voice to obey. The man on the floor tried to crawl away and I put my boot on his back and pushed him down until he stopped moving. "Get out," I told him. "Get out of my house. Get out of my life." He spat and wrenched himself free, scrambling to the doorway with a scraped palm, and she called after him with a casualness that felt like betrayal turned into a performance. "Tell your followers I'll be back for a live Q&A later." The world tilted and I saw myself from the ceiling like a diorama, me, the villain, hands shaking, a man who'd once promised to be better. I had to do something that didn't explode the rest of my life, but my brain only supplied the options that lead to more wreckage. I grabbed my jacket and my keys because leaving seemed like the least stupid move, at least if I left I could pretend to my neighbors that I was the wrong man walking away. But as I stepped toward the door she grabbed my sleeve and that small, soft anchor, like rope around my ankle, made me stay. "Don't walk away," she hissed. "Go ahead and walk away and see how many people hang around that open house. You think anyone will cry for you?" She knew how to wound me better than anyone. She'd honed it. A sliver of self-awareness cut through the fog, she was baiting me to stay so she could call the cops, or worse, frame me exactly the way she wanted, hot, violent, unstable. The rational part of my brain screamed to get into the car, drive to a motel, call a lawyer. The animal part wanted to stay and make her regret. I felt furious at my cowardice when I realized I was frozen. That moment of paralysis is its own kind of violence. Then she did the thing that finally unglued me, she reached up and pushed my face like a child would, like she was flattening something small and smirking. "You're pathetic," she said softly, as if offering comfort. I saw red. The next second is a blur of motion and shame. I grabbed the nightstand and threw it aside, scattering items, pictures of us, cheap souvenirs from trips we took in a cleaner life that now felt like props, and then I shoved her hard. She stumbled back and slammed into the closet door, and for a second I watched her like a stranger, thinking maybe I'd finally made things hurt enough she'd understand. Instead she laughed a short, incredulous bark and pulled herself up with hair in her face and mascara smeared, eyes blazing with something like triumph. "You hit me," she said, and the words were a pistol shot. "You actually hit me." The apartment seemed to tilt. I could feel my heart ricochet against my ribs. She wasn't crying or pleading, she was counting. She was building her case. I realized with the cold clarity of someone watching a professional at work that the next move would decide everything. Call the cops and it could be me in cuffs, do nothing and I would be living a lie of my own making. The rational voice finally crowded in, "Get out before the neighbors decide to call the police over the noise." So I did the most pathetic thing imaginable, I left. I slammed the door behind me, ears ringing, hands stained with sweat and something that might have been blood. Outside, the night air was stupidly clean, like the universe had washed itself of the moment. I walked until the pavement blurred and my lungs hurt, and every step felt like a split between two lives, one that could have been, one I was slamming the trunk on. I called my therapist at 2 a.m. because my hands were still shaking and someone had to know I was trying. He listened and said the right things: breathwork, grounding, remember consequences, and then he asked if I'd contacted the police. I lied and said no. The truth was, I was terrified of what the police report would look like with her story. I was terrified of what it meant that she could make me into the monster I'd always feared I might be. I lay on the hood of my car, looking at the pale streetlight, and told myself I had to be smarter. I had to build evidence. I had to document. But building evidence felt like admitting defeat. It felt like saying I'd failed the basic test of being someone who didn't erupt. Rage and shame and self-loathing wrestled in me until I was empty, and with that emptiness came a resolution so brittle it would break like glass. Tomorrow I would go back, I would collect proof, and I would confront her in a way that didn't end with me in cuffs. I wanted to be better and I wanted to punish her, and both things lived in me at once, claws out. The night stretched like a wound and I lay awake feeling like whatever choice I made next would determine whether I saved what remained or obliterated it for good. I walked until the city bled neon and my lungs felt like they were scraping metal, until the anger that had been a roar in my chest dulled into the low, dangerous hum of something that never quite leaves you, and only then did I let myself think clearly enough to plan, because planning is how men like me keep the animal down for one more day. I drove to the cheap motel I'd used once when a business trip ran late, the kind of place with flickering signage and a clerk who never asked your name twice, and I sat at the motel's sagging table with a pen and a legal pad and wrote down everything I could remember, timestamps, phrases, who said what. My hands still shook. Writing slows you down in a way screaming never does. I made the list methodical: camera on nightstand, third-party stream, tattoos on the guy's forearm that a quick search might reveal, the registration sticker on the van outside 3 nights ago when he'd left, the audio clip where he'd laughed and said my name like it was a joke. Each line was a thread I could pull. I knew instinctively you don't go back into a house after breaking like that without something to hold up against the other person's story. I'm not proud of that calculus, but there it is. The motel bed creaked when I lay down, and sleep didn't come. Instead, an ugly, fast inventory of my life ran, past fights, busted plates, birthdays I'd forgotten, the way I'd cornered her about texts and she'd slithered away with a joke. I admitted things to myself I'd never let her hear: my jealousy, my temper, my pride. Admitting them didn't make me less furious. Maybe it made me more human, maybe it made me more dangerous, because I could see the path I was sliding down and I still walked it. At dawn I returned to the apartment with a camera phone full of infernal resolve. I had to be smarter. I parked 2 blocks over, circled once to make sure no one followed, then walked up with my headphones in like a man going to buy bread, calm on purpose. I fumbled a spare key, one hidden under a plant pot like some sitcom cliche, and let the lock click. Inside the place still smelled like sex and alcohol and burnt lamp, the residue of scenes I was supposed to recognize as ours. I moved like a man who'd been rehearsing for months, opening drawers, scanning hard drives, looking for digital footprints. The camera on the nightstand was probably smashed, but people who stream leave backups, they use cloud accounts, they sync. I found a small external drive shoved under the mattress, narrow but heavy, and my stomach turned when the folder names came up: Livestream_0621, tips, DMS_anon. I copied everything onto a thumb drive and felt my hands finally stop shaking because action is its own sedative. I scrolled through the messages like a surgeon poking at a wound: flirtations, the way she teased him about public shows, hundreds of viewers jeering. There was one exchange that landed me like a punch, a DM from last week where she typed, "It's getting boring here. Need more edge. You in?" and his reply, smug and quick, "Always. Tonight's gonna be the one." He's away. The he in that sentence felt like a nail through my hand. I saved screenshots, timestamps, IP addresses, anything that would show premeditation. Evidence is unromantic, and in my mind it was also salvation. I wanted the cops to see it, I wanted a lawyer to see it, I wanted the world to see that this wasn't a moment, it was a pattern. And yet even as I collected proof, the old animal buzzed: take the evidence, confront them, break whatever needed breaking. I fought that reflex back down until the paperwork filled the thumb drive and my head stopped pulsing. I left a note on the kitchen table, cold, composed, not the thing the man upstairs would have screamed. I have copies. Don't contact me. Lawyer and police if you touch me or him again. I didn't sign it because a signature felt too personal, it felt like bait. I walked out and sat in my car like a man holding his breath, and then I phoned my brother, the one sane person in my life who'd seen me at my worst and still answered. "You okay?" he asked, voice clipped. I told him everything in half sentences: the stream, the smashing, the slap, and when I finished he made a single, terrible suggestion: don't go back alone. Get a witness. Call the cops. My throat closed. Calling the cops felt like admitting defeat, but it also felt like not becoming the story she would tell. I agreed to wait, and then the agreement faltered because waiting is for cowards, and I am not wholly a coward. At noon I walked back into the apartment with my brother in tow. He hung back by the door like he was ready to drag me out by the collar if anything went sideways. My wife opened the door like she'd been expecting us: perfect hair, a robe tied like armor, a smile that was practiced for the camera but razor-sharp in person. "You brought someone to witness your pity party?" she asked, mock celebratory. The man from the bed, patched up and cocky, appeared behind her like a threat in human skin. My brother's jaw tightened. I didn't want to fight in front of another person, I wanted to be smarter than that. I laid the thumb drive on the table, slid the screenshots across, and watched the color drain from her face in a slow, satisfying arc. "You broadcast this," I said to the man, and for once my voice stayed level. "You built an audience in my house. You planned it." He smirked, too sure of himself. "That's showbiz, man. People pay to see forbidden." My brother snapped then, something I'm grateful for because it gave me a buffer I needed. "You're in my brother's bed. You should leave." The guy scoffed. "Or what?" he said. The air tautened. I felt the old Blackpool anger like tide, and I knew I could let it swallow me. But something else clicked, a memory of a morning with my dad, small and stubborn and awful in its simplicity: if you're going to break, break for a reason. That line sounded stupidly noble, but it held. I stood up, not to punch or to shove, but to speak. I told them I had evidence, everything, and that if they didn't leave now I would give it to the police and a lawyer, and that if anyone tried to bait me into violence he would be the one arrested. My voice didn't tremble. I felt like a man watching himself perform anger and choosing not to deliver the final act. My wife laughed, a high, bitter sound that made my skin crawl. You really think that will stop me? She asked. The world will eat you alive. Everyone will pick the villain. You think you're not the guy who loses his temper? People will choose the easy story. She almost convinced me. She almost made me think that no matter what I did I'd be the headline. But then the man, stupid, arrogant, breath too loud, and my brother moved like lightning, grabbing him by the collar and hauling him toward the door. The man cursed, shoved, and fled, a coward finally matching his mouth with action but running when consequences arrived. My wife slammed the door behind him and then turned on me, her face a mask of wounds I'd given her but she'd cultivated into martyrdom. You think you can come back and control the narrative, she spat. You can't. You never could. I left with the thumb drive burning weight in my pocket and more contradictions in my chest than I'd had before, shame, relief, and the hollow knowledge that I'd almost been what I feared. I wanted to be better, to not be the man who breaks, but the white-hot ember of rage that lives under my ribs whispered that maybe being better was a coward's lie. I drove away and for the first time in years I made the phone calls I should have made when the lamp shattered lawyer, therapist, a number for a men's anger group my therapist had once recommended. I sat in the car and let every one of those grown-up choices be proof I could be bigger than the fit. I'm not sure if that day changed me permanently, but it changed the way I would fight, less with fists, more with evidence, and with the ugly, exhausting work of being honest about the parts of me I hated. I drove until the city lights became a smear and only then let myself cry, the kind of ugly, hot, guttural crying that feels like it could burn a man clean. I don't get to do that often, my instinct has always been to swallow, to turn everything into a task list, but that night the grief and the rage and the humiliation stitched themselves together into something I couldn't swallow anymore, so I let it out, leaned on the steering wheel, and promised myself two things. 1, I would not let this become the story everyone tells about me, and 2, I would not let this beat me into being someone I wasn't proud of. That promise sounded noble in the dark and honest, but promises are stupid until you make a plan to back them up. So I made a plan. Step 1, lawyer. Step 2, document. Step 3, don't pick the fight she wants. The next morning I put on clothes that weren't sweat-stained or smelling like last night's adrenaline and I walked into a lawyer's office with the kind of careful calm that felt foreign and fragile. I handed over the thumb drive like it was a clean weapon. The lawyer was practical and not romantic, exactly the kind of person I needed. She said things with numbers and possibilities and no moralizing, which is what you want when you're trying to not combust. We file a civil harassment claim, we preserve evidence, we get a protective order if needed. Hearing those dry sentences slowed my pulse. It's amazing how legal jargon can be a better sedative than any pill my doctor has ever prescribed. I left with a retainer and a list of next steps and, despite everything, the tiniest thread of relief that I was finally funneling the mess into a tool I could use that wasn't my fist. But the practical path doesn't erase the emotional minefield. At home the apartment was a crime scene of our marriage, broken lamp shards, a bloody smear that would clean but not unmean, framed photos with glass spiderwebbed across them like a spider had decided to take up residency in our history. I took pictures, then I boxed up anything that could be used as a prop in a story she'd cook up, a sweater, a framed birthday card, a coffee mug with a chip, and I documented every bruise and every mark like a man cataloging his own ruin. The act of documenting felt like a betrayal and a salvation at once. Then came the calls. My brother called often, sometimes to tell me to breathe, sometimes to remind me to eat. My therapist called, too, and I lied less to him than to anyone else. I told him how close I'd come to being that monster I feared and how terrified I was that one day I'd be the kind of headline people nodded at and moved on. Therapy became more than a checklist. Those sessions were arguments with myself where I learned to name the cyclone and to ask a simple question: what do I want this to make me? The lawyer filed a preservation order and the police finally took a statement after some bureaucratic sighs. The cop was annoyingly humane. He didn't call me crazy or violent, he just said, "We'll take your report, we'll add the images, and we'll advise." It felt both hollow and necessary. Meanwhile she ran her own network of damage control like a pro. At first I thought she'd be sloppy, guilty parties often are, but she was meticulous. Friends of ours texted sympathy with a performative edge. One neighbor asked me, in a voice too bright, if maybe I'd been provocative because she'd seen us argue. I wanted to chase every one of them down and make them carry the lump of guilt she'd created, but I was trying to be smarter. Still, the social thing stung worse than the physical. Humiliation is a worm that eats from the top down. My wife's replies to the legal notices were precise and cold. Her lawyer wrote that the livestream was consensual, that I had a history of anger and thus any narrative I pushed would be unreliable. It was a perfect little trap. Paint the man as volatile and everything he says becomes a confession. The system was set up to reward such performances. I felt like I was playing chess in a house of mirrors. I could feel the old animal pacing beneath my ribs, smelling blood at the edges of strategy and wanting to tear everything down, and I had to fight him. I used the fight like a muscle, breathing techniques, counting, leaving rooms before the fuse burned down. But fight or no fight, I had moments. Innocuous ones that turned sharp. Once, at a grocery store, I saw a man glance at me the wrong way, somehow pity and judgment in the same look, and my hands twitched so hard for violence that I nearly grabbed a can of soup and hurled it. I caught myself because some part of me could still hear the lecture from one of the therapists, interruption before eruption. I breathed, I counted, I walked away. Those small wins stacked. They didn't feel like much, but they were proof. The legal process moved at the glacial speed of paper pushing weights down a river. Her lawyer's office drafted statements, I sat with my own counsel and told the truth, every raw painful ugly thing I could remember, and we built a narrative anchored in documents rather than screams. I did the boring, terrible adult things, subpoenas for IP logs, certified copies of chat histories, witnesses lined up who'd seen the livestream. It felt antiseptic and impotent to reduce heartache to JPGs, timestamps, and bank transfers, but the evidence grew like armor. Then, the night before the hearing, she came to the front of the building where I was meeting a friend who'd agreed to be my witness and she did something I never imagined. She started to cry. Not that dramatic, theatrical weeping we become so practiced at using like currency. Hers was soft and real and startling. She said my name and asked if we could talk, to which some stubborn part of me answered yes because old habits are heavy as anchors. We sat on a bench and she looked smaller than the woman who toyed with my life. There was something exhausted and raw about her voice when she said, "I didn't want to hurt you." That line was thin as paper. Then why? I asked, and she looked away, tears slipping. I needed someone to see me. I'm tired of being safe. The honesty cut in a new place entirely, because it was human and selfish and petty and utterly her. I felt sorry and furious in the same breath. I told her I'd put together the file and that if she didn't stop the stream and if the evidence showed premeditation, I'd press charges. She nodded like a tired little animal head. Do what you must, she whispered. It should have felt like victory and instead it felt like another fracture. The thing I had to hold on to was this: I was trying, a messy, imperfect, often failing trying, but I was trying to not make the same choices again. I wanted justice but not at the cost of becoming the caricature everyone predicted. I wanted her to feel the consequences of what she'd done, but I also wanted us, somehow, to be honest, if only for a moment. That honesty is fragile. It's a coin tossed on a table that might buy you peace or might buy you nothing at all. Tomorrow the court would see our file and the world would get a version of the truth. Maybe it would be enough, maybe it would be nothing. Either way, I had to show up without letting the animal win. That was the real test. Court day arrived like a storm with a face, gray, inevitable, and full of static. I ironed a shirt I hadn't worn in months because appearances matter in a room full of strangers who will render you into a sentence, volatile or victim, dangerous or wronged. My hands trembled tying my tie and I hated myself a little for wanting to look decent, for caring how I'd be read. The lawyer rode shotgun like a calm animal. Diego sat behind me like a witness made of muscle and patience. I rehearsed phrases in my head, measured, factual, not spiky, and the rehearsed words felt like armor because the other kind of words, the ones that lived in my ribs, were incendiary and immediate. The courthouse smelled of coffee and paper and small cruelties. People I'd known nodded politely like extras in a life I'd lost control of. My wife walked in late, hair immaculate, sunglasses on even inside. She looked like a woman who trained herself to be believed by staring at lights until her pupils learned the shape of lies. She smiled at me with something that was not warmth. The gallery filled with a murmuring crowd. Someone recorded on their phone with clinical detachment while other people leaned forward hungry for the spectacle. The judge skimmed the file like a man paging through a script and called us up. My hands were damp on the table. I felt the theater of the moment, the cameras, the whispers, the people who already decided the plot. We gave our statements. My lawyer calibrated my voice into a machine. He documented evidence. We have timestamps, DMs, witness accounts of the livestream. She, my wife, gave hers with the practiced tremor. It was consensual. He has a long history of instability. He's been violent before. The phrase hit like a punch because people believe patterns, even when those patterns are stitched together by performance. The judge issued a temporary restraining order and set a hearing date. He tried to be fair, but the law is blunt when people are complicated. After court, the press planted microphones with the tenderness of vultures. A woman from a local talk show wanted to know if I feared for my reputation. I wanted to tell her I feared being the man I sometimes saw in the mirror, the one who breaks lamps and smashes cameras, the one who could lose everything when he loses himself. Instead, I said the adult sentence: I'm cooperating. I'm seeking help. Which was true, in its small way. The cameras ate the sound and made a headline that framed me like a cautionary tale. The worst part wasn't the paper. It was how small I felt in people's eyes afterward, like a thing you tap and then move on from. In the days after court, I tried to be surgical about my life: therapy, group sessions, calls to a lawyer who taught me to think in subpoenas. I started anger management again, not the corny pamphlet version but the hard work, naming triggers, leaving rooms, calling a friend before the internal fuse burned. I learned to say, I'm stepping back, and actually step back. Those were victories. But victories are thin when the world you love sits on a table you smashed. Friends were messy, some stayed, some carved polite distance. My brother checked in with a voice like a man who's seen a house burn and no smoke change his lungs forever. The internet did the thing it does best: condensed my life into a meme and a debate thread where strangers decided what I deserved. That cut in small, precise ways. There were nights I slept with one eye open, listening for a door that might slam in retaliation or a camera that might whine like a toy. Then, like a tide that never keeps appointments, a small thing tipped me. A garbage truck backed up at dawn and the noise set my heart on a fuse. I got a text from an old friend asking if I'd seen the latest comments, people bringing up a fight from 5 years ago, an old video of me drunk at a wedding that was framed as proof I'd always been broken. The narrative formation of strangers can be cruel. They mix the past with the present until you drown in both. I felt that old clenching under my ribs, the same chemical recipe my body had leaned on for years. Instead of calling a therapist, I almost called her my wife, because part of me still wanted the raw, private antidote of her presence. The thought was a betrayal of progress and I hated myself for it. I walked to the window and breathed like my life depended on it. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a DM from someone claiming to be a fan of her channel, taunting, attaching a clip where I'd lost my temper months ago at a dinner party, words out of context, cruelty and fast forward. The screen light made my hands small. I felt the animal stir. I told myself to close the phone and I almost couldn't. It was absurd how pleading the urge felt: fight, shame, fix, but I caught it. I put the phone down, called Diego, and told him everything. He listened, then came over 20 minutes later with coffee and a look that asked me to keep promises to myself. We sat in my kitchen like men who'd been to war and survived. We spoke about contingency plans, who to call when I felt like I might snap, where to go, when to surrender a night to a friend who would take me far from knives and keyboards. It was not glamorous. It was work. But the worst test came when I ran into her at the supermarket. My cart screamed down the aisle like a thing with purpose, and she was there in produce, a parfait of charm and deflection, a basket of organic everything. Her eyes met mine and I saw her measure me: danger, pity, irritation, victory, all layered. Someone shouted across the aisle, "You still together," like a punchline. Her smile was thin. Without thinking, without the buffer of plan or counsel, I said something I should never have said in public, too loud, hot, and stupid: "You don't get to make me the villain and then laugh about it." The words landed and the store folded its attention toward us. She didn't flinch, she raised an eyebrow and, with the theatrical grace of a practiced performer, said to the cashier like conversation was a weapon, "He's stressed. I'm worried about him." People soften because it's easier to pity than to judge. That split-second maneuver, her turning the narrative with a look, hit me harder than any slap. I felt the old black well up, but something new stopped me. People around us were watching, yes, but more importantly, my brother's voice echoed in my head urging me to choose the slow, ugly route of paperwork over spectacle. I swallowed like the world had folded and walked away. That restraint felt like a rebirth and like a loss. Later, when I was alone, the animal in me started whispering about fairness and to hell with consequences. I felt the pull and I did the only healthy, humiliating thing I could. I called my therapist at midnight and said, I almost lost it. He asked me what I did instead. I told the truth. I left the store, I breathed, I called a friend. He made me repeat it until the phrase stopped sounding like an excuse and started sounding like a shield. Recovery isn't linear. It's a rope you climb while the ocean tries to yank you back. I climbed that night and for the first time in months I let myself believe maybe I could be the man who keeps his fists to himself and still makes the other parts of his life whole. The weeks after the supermarket scene felt like living inside a pressure cooker with the valve jammed. Every day was some new reminder that even if I was trying to build myself back, she was still out there twisting the knife, making sure the story wasn't just about betrayal but about me being the monster she'd been telling people I was for years. I kept my head down, I went to group therapy, I showed up at work on time like a robot trying to prove he wasn't broken, but then one night Diego shoved his phone in my face and there she was again, my wife, live streaming, telling hundreds of strangers about how her ex had violent outbursts, how she feared for her safety, how she couldn't talk about details because of legal stuff but that she was finally free. She didn't say my name, but she didn't need to. The comments scrolled faster than I could breathe, classic abuser story. She's so strong. He doesn't deserve her. It was like watching myself be buried alive by pixels. I wanted to punch through the screen, wanted to scream until the whole building knew the truth, but all I did was sit there shaking while Diego tried to tell me to let the lawyers handle it. Easy for him to say his life wasn't being turned into entertainment for strangers who love to hate me. The worst part? She was good at it. She cried in just the right moments, laughed in ways that made her look resilient, leaned forward into the camera like she was confiding in a best friend. It was theater, and she was nailing the role. And me? I was the villain in absentia. I slammed my fist on the table so hard the coffee mug jumped and cracked. Diego flinched. You gotta calm down, man, he said, but my chest was lava. Calm down? I barked. She's out there making me into a goddamn monster and you want me to calm down? I could hear my own voice echoing off the walls, knew I was proving her point even in the safety of my own apartment, but that didn't matter. All that mattered was the injustice of it, the humiliation crawling under my skin. For 2 hours I paced the room, muttering, fists clenching, teeth grinding, and then, like the stupid reckless man I drove to her place. I told myself I wouldn't go inside, I just wanted to see for myself, to prove she wasn't the saint she was pretending to be online. Her lights were on, the glow spilling through the curtains. I saw shadows moving inside. And then I saw him. That same tattooed idiot, leaning against her counter, laughing like he belonged there. My head buzzed, my chest screamed, and the rational voice in my head, the one I'd been trying to nurture in therapy, was barely a whisper compared to the roar of rage. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my hands hurt. For a second I saw myself marching up the stairs, kicking the door down, showing them both what consequences felt like. I pictured it too clearly, and that scared the hell out of me because once I picture something, I usually act. I don't know how long I sat there, breathing like I was drowning, before I finally forced the car back into gear and drove away. I screamed into the steering wheel until my throat felt raw, because walking away made me feel weak and strong at the same time. The next morning I told my lawyer everything. She looked me dead in the eye and said, if you had gone in there, we wouldn't be having this conversation, you'd be calling me from jail. You need to decide what's more important, proving you're right, or keeping your freedom. That stung because it was too true. But later that week, she crossed another line. She showed up at my workplace. Not inside, no, she's smarter than that, but outside, in the parking lot, waiting with that smug little smile like she'd rehearsed it. Just wanted to talk, she said sweetly, as if we were still a couple. I told her to leave, my voice shaking with the effort of keeping it level. Or what, she taunted. You'll hit me again? You'll give me exactly what I need to ruin you? Her words were poison, and I swallowed them whole. For a second, my body lunged before my brain caught up. My hand twitched. She saw it and smiled wider. She wanted it. She wanted me to explode, to grab her, to shove her, to prove her narrative true. It was the most toxic, manipulative game I'd ever been part of. And I almost lost. But Diego was there, thank God, because he grabbed my arm and pulled me back like a leash on a rabid dog. Not like this, he hissed, and I could hear the fear in his voice. She laughed then, a light cruel laugh, and walked away like she'd already won. I stood in that parking lot, shaking so hard I thought I'd collapse, and all I could think was how thin the line had become between me saving myself and me destroying myself. And I hated her for knowing exactly how to dance on that line. I knew she wouldn't stop after the parking lot stunt, but I didn't expect how far she'd go. A few days later I got a knock at my door, 2 cops standing there, calm but sharp, asking if I'd had an altercation with my wife recently. My stomach sank like I'd swallowed concrete. I told them no, I kept my distance, and one of them raised an eyebrow before handing me a copy of a report. She'd filed a complaint saying I'd followed her, harassed her, even threatened her. She claimed she felt unsafe, that she feared for her life. Reading those words made my blood boil because I could see the trap snapping shut around me. She was setting the narrative in ink now, not just pixels. I explained myself, lawyer, restraining order, everything documented, but the cops still gave me the same warning, stay away. One wrong move and this doesn't end in paperwork. When they left, I punched the wall so hard my knuckles split again. I hated myself instantly because bleeding knuckles are exactly what they expect from me, exactly the proof she's hoping for. I wrapped them in a towel, shaking, muttering curses, pacing like an animal in a cage. Later that night I saw she'd posted on her stream again, showing the tiny scratch on her wrist like a badge of honor, telling her followers that I'd grabbed her in public, that I was dangerous, unhinged, trying to ruin her. And the comments flooded in, file charges. Get a restraining order. Stay strong, queen. She was turning my rage into currency. And I was the idiot supplying it. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything, wondering if maybe I was crazy, maybe I had crossed lines I couldn't see. That's the most dangerous part of being angry, you start doubting yourself because you know how ugly you can be, so maybe all the accusations feel half true even when they're not. By morning I had dark circles under my eyes and a head full of static. My lawyer told me to sit tight, that false reports happen, that she'd handle it. But sitting tight felt like suffocating. So I did the stupidest thing possible, I went to her apartment. Not to scream, not to fight, but to talk. At least that's what I told myself. I waited until she came out with that tattooed idiot by her side, and the second she saw me she smirked like she'd been waiting. There he is, she said loudly, voice full of fake fear, the psycho who can't let go. My pulse spiked. Neighbors turned their heads. The guy puffed up his chest and shoved me lightly, just enough to provoke. Leave her alone, man, he said with that cocky grin. My fists clenched so hard my nails dug into my palms. I wanted to smash his teeth in, to wipe that smug look off his face forever. But then I saw her phone out, recording. She was baiting me in 4K. I froze, every muscle screaming, every nerve begging for release, but I forced myself to back away, muttering under my breath. She laughed, loud and cruel, shouting after me so the neighbors could hear, run away, coward. You're finished. My vision blurred with rage and shame. I drove off before I did something irreversible. That night I sat in my car, parked miles away, gripping the steering wheel until my hands cramped. I hated her, I hated him, but most of all I hated myself for still loving her voice even when it was poison, for still wanting to prove something to a woman who only wanted me destroyed. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, they're setting you up. Stop playing their game. I didn't know who sent it, but it rattled me to the core because it was exactly what I already feared. And yet, even knowing it, I wasn't sure I could stop. The anger wasn't just in me anymore, it was me. Every step I took away from her felt like losing, every step toward her felt like suicide, and I couldn't tell which one scared me more. I told myself I wouldn't let her script the ending, that I would be smarter than the cheap narrative she wanted to sell to strangers, but somewhere between the third smear post and the voicemail from my boss asking if everything was okay, something snapped like a cheap spring. It was a Tuesday gray, useless rain that made the city smell like old coffee, and I was late to a meeting I couldn't afford to miss because sleep had evaporated and every notification on my phone felt like a needle. I'd been careful for weeks, rehearsing calm like a ritual, naming triggers, calling Diego when the dark came, sitting in waiting rooms until reason crawled back in. But that morning a clip surfaced, her channel posting an edited montage of our night, subtitles calling me unstable, followed by screenshots of some anonymous eyewitness claiming I'd been violent before. The comments were fireworks. People I'd known in high school were sending links with little gloating notes. I shut the laptop with so much force coffee sloshed onto my sleeve. That's when I drove to her place. I told myself I would not knock, I would not confront, I'd hand the evidence to the lawyer, film the exchange, and be dignified. I parked 2 blocks away and watched through rain-streaked glass as the tattooed idiot arrived, more sharply dressed today, like he'd come to celebrate something. She opened the door and kissed him with a hunger that made my guts clench in a way that wasn't jealousy so much as the physical sensation of humiliation. The rational plan disintegrated. I walked up the steps before I could stop myself, and by the time I was on the landing my throat had a raw knot of sound that was equal parts panic and a scream. I rang the bell and when the door opened she looked at me like a camera was pointed right through me, so practiced, so certain. Mark, she said, that name clipped like a verdict. What are you doing here? I saw the guy step back a pace, and something in his face was equal parts, this is my trophy, and don't get blood on my shirt. The polite script I'd been practicing evaporated. I walked in before they could lock the door and the apartment was small, smells of incense and the faint tang of alcohol, and she smiled like she was hosting a show. Don't touch me, she said, voice flat. Please leave. I don't know when my voice stopped being mine and turned into something that scraped the floor. You posted that montage. You manufactured witnesses. You lied. The idiot laughed like a heel in a bad movie. You obsess, man. Move on. That laugh was a match to dry tinder. I can't justify what I did next, and I'm not going to try to give it noble language. What I did was desperate, thuggish, and stupid. I shoved him. Not a tap. A full shove that sent him into a glass-top table which exploded into noise and glitter and shards that flashed on his skin. He grabbed at his throat, more startled than hurt, but he hit the floor hard and the apartment turned into a bad slow-motion collage, the camera in the corner blinking red as if it were recording a morality play, her hand flying to her mouth, neighbors' voices swelling like background music, and then the sound of someone dialing. She screamed, loud and practiced and perfect, he attacked me. He attacked him, and the apartment condensed into that sentence and the world pivoted. I could feel the pivot under my feet, and for a second the horror of what I'd done registered like cold water. I saw myself in the reflection of a broken mirror, wild eyes, blood on my knuckle from the glass I'd cut when I shoved him, clothes torn, the kind of portrait that gets splashed across morning shows with thin voiceovers and pity. The sirens arrived fast, like fate with a timetable. I could have left, run, hide, anything, but there was nowhere logical to run to, and the animal in me wanted to stay and at least make them see the mess she'd made, make them watch the raw thing she'd produced. Instead, I stood there like a man whose muscle memory had failed him, and then the door opened and two uniforms filled it up, and their expressions were textbook: caution, procedural calm, then a scan of the room and in a line with her story, because bodies and glass and a man looking like he'd been at the center of the hurricane make for easy narratives. They asked for versions. I wanted to talk, to tell them how it began, how the camera, the DMs, the staged witness, how 10 years of small cruelties had stacked into this. But the words came out like static. She told her story in tight, crying sentences that fit perfectly into a report. I fumbled and the breath left me like someone had stolen it. The cuffs came after the questions, an iron closure that sounded in my ears like a judge. As they led me outside, the neighbors watched, faces peeking through curtains and iPhones lifted like crosses. The idiot was on his feet, more theatrical than hurt, playing the shot card like a pro. My chest felt hollowed out. In the squad car, the officer read me my rights with a bored precision. The rain hit the window like a curtain on a stage I never auditioned for. I kept thinking, I knew I was dangerous. I always knew. That knowledge had not been enough to stop me from letting her make me into the headline she wanted. At the precinct, they booked me mugshot, fingerprints, and the world condensed to fluorescent lights and the smell of disinfectant. My phone, full of the evidence I'd collected, sat in a locker somewhere, my lawyer's calls bouncing off the bureaucracy like pebbles in a drum. Later, when they brought me to the holding cell and I had a second to breathe, a cold, clear thought washed over me: this is exactly what she wanted. The hand that had pushed, the camera that had caught it, together they were a trap calibrated over months. I felt like a lab specimen with formulas in my bloodstream. But the horror that followed the clarity was worse. Even if I'd walked out earlier, even if I'd been patient, she'd still have been able to craft a narrative. The difference was that this time I'd helped her. I had supplied the spectacle. In the gray wait for bail, friends staying oddly quiet and the lawyer's face thin as paper, I sat on a bench and cried, not the raw burn I'd known in the car, but a small, mortified noise that was all shame. I had wanted to be not the monster, and I'd failed spectacularly. The world would call me volatile, and they wouldn't be entirely wrong. The police report would live forever in databases, the clips would be reposted and stitched into a timeline that excised my reasons and amplified my worst moments. The system loves a villain who can't be complicated, and I'd given them one on a silver platter. I had been angry, I had been betrayed, I had been manipulated, and none of that was a clean defense in front of a camera that caught my hands where they shouldn't be. When my lawyer finally arrived, thin and efficient, she said the things I needed to hear in a voice that wasn't pitying: bail, restraining order, possible charges, options. There was a cold clarity to legalese that stripped melodrama into consequences. I listened, and the man who always saw himself as angry but redeemable folded a little. The holding cell door clanged, and for the first time fear wasn't the red heat of rage but the slow, sinking weight of a life unspooling. I thought about Diego, about therapy, about the promises I tried to keep. I thought about the man on the floor who laughed into the camera, and I hated where my hands had landed. I'd always been told anger is an emotion. It's not. It's a chain that links to the past. I'd been taught to cut it before it tightened, and for weeks I'd held the scissors. But the woman I married had a different kind of training: how to place a camera, how to craft a story, how to make sure the world was on her side the moment a man lost his temper. I had met her with fists and she met me with cameras, and in the end the cameras won. Sitting under the fluorescent lights, cuffs off but wrists stinging like memory, I made a vow that was quieter than rage: if I ever had the chance to rebuild anything, it would not be on the ruins of violence. I would have to do the most humiliating work, accept responsibility, face consequences, and try to turn the scandal into accountability, of myself first, and maybe, if the world let me, of the system that made staging abuse so easy. I woke up in a cell-scented haze, and for the first time the idea of consequence wasn't an abstract lecture from a therapist or a legal form to sign, it was a thing with teeth. Bail came with strings: no contact, surrender your firearms, I didn't have any, thank God, mandatory check-ins, and a court date that hung over me like a storm cloud. The internet did its job for its cruel audience: clips of me shoving, of glass and blood and her perfect camera face, looped, remixed, given snappy headlines. People I hadn't seen in 10 years sent thoughts and prayers that read like verdicts. My phone became a chorus of expectation and disgust. I slept in 3-hour increments for weeks, and in those black hours I taught myself the mechanics of regret: you breathe, you name the feeling, you do not act. It sounds textbook and stupid until you realize the theory's a razor without practice. Court became a theater of inevitabilities. Her lawyer read a script that made me look monstrous without ever spelling out why a marriage decays into this. My lawyer, blunt, efficient, kept me tethered to reality with paperwork and small mercies: plead to a lesser charge, do the programs, keep your probation clean. You walk out, but you don't walk back into your old life. I took the deal like a man choosing stitches over amputation. The judge gave a sentence that felt both merciful and necessary: community service, mandated anger management classes, a restraining order, and no jail time beyond the night in the cell. In the sterile light of the courtroom I repeated my apology into the microphone: careful, measured, legal, and it came out tiny and honest. She watched from the gallery like she was part spectator, part victor. After court the settlement spoke louder than civics. We both signed things that meant neither of us would talk publicly about the other. The live stream channels went dark, at least for a while. She kept custody of the narrative online, and I kept the heavy, private parts: therapy records, check-ins, the small humiliations of progress. It would have been easy to leave it there and stay angry. Easier to keep a righteous ulcer of bitterness, to tell myself the world misread me. But something in me had split open during that night in the holding cell, not a self-justifying wound but a space where a different choice might live. I showed up to court-ordered programs like a man doing penance, grudging at first, then with the weird, slow curiosity of someone learning a new language. The group was a messy collection of men with different monsters, some that sounded like me, some that were just different. The facilitator, a woman whose face had the long patience of someone who'd seen all the worst, made us read our worst lines out loud. I read mine, voice shaking, and the room didn't cheer or condemn, it listened. There's a kind of sanctity in being seen without being coddled. I also did the practical humiliations lawyers love, a public apology letter I had to read into a recorded statement, court-ordered counseling with a therapist who didn't let me hide behind stress. He taught me cognitive tools that sound like common sense because they are, name the trigger, step away, call someone. I learned to sleep without the roar in my chest, not always, but often. The world didn't forgive me because I asked it to. People watched for slips like ornithologists watching a rare bird, and when I stumbled, saying something too sharp in a grocery line, cutting someone off in traffic, the internet found it and polished the clip. But neighbors who used to nod politely started nodding with a new awkwardness, and one woman who once posted a sympathetic gif in the comments sent me a text asking if I needed someone to walk with at night. Small mercies. My brother was steady, he didn't lecture so much as show up with beer and a blunt assessment when I deserved it. You could have gone to jail, he said flatly once, while we ate microwaved pizza in his shabby kitchen. You didn't. Use that. So I did the ugly maintenance of staying alive without breaking things, the classes, the check-ins, the journal of triggers I didn't want to write but had to. The hospital smell in my memory started to get edged with other things, late-night phone calls with Tommy, our weird neighbor kid, now in supervised counseling, Anna? No, she and I never reconciled. She moved out within weeks, her presence on social media ghosted at times by legal language and at others pulsing with performative grief. The man with tattoos? He disappeared into silence like a bad cameo in a show cancelled after one season. The public thirst for a neat ending was never satisfied, there's no symbol to tie up, no cinematic catharsis. There was only the slow work. Months later, I stood in front of a room of men and said the thing I feared to say, I miss my old life. I don't want to be the guy in the clip. I want to not hurt people. Someone in the back clapped, quietly, like attendance mattered. That kind of applause is small and human and not at all like the roaring approval I'd once thought I wanted. My therapist told me something that sat with me, redemption isn't a trophy you win. It's a habit. So I practiced it, habitually. I learned to apologize properly, to mean it without letting apology replace action. I rebuilt friendships that weren't performance-based and admitted to people who'd been close that I had been dangerous and that I was working to be less so. The hardest thing? Loving someone who'd hurt you and letting that love be a memory rather than a map. I still loved her in a way that hurt, a raw ache for what we'd been before the cameras. But love is not a license to be destructive, and I could not build a future that allowed the same patterns. In quieter moments I read the news about staged livestreams and cancel culture and how easy it is to weaponize the selfie against a person. I understood her agency and I also understood where cruelty finds clever tools. Somewhere in the mess we both became experts at performance, she in making victims the currency of attention, me in being the temperamental husband whose exceptions had to be handled with caution. Neither of us fit neat categories. That complexity doesn't make forgiveness automatic, but it does make the truth human. Years later, my life isn't clean. I still flinch at the sound of breaking glass. I still check in with my therapist before I make a decision I might regret. But I'm not the same animal that walked into my bedroom that night. I teach an anger management workshop now once a month, not because I fancy myself a saint but because I know the utility of someone else saying, I was here, too, and showing a map out. People come and sit and tell stories of almost domestic incidents, almost arrests, almost life-changing choices, and we talk about tools, not absolution. Sometimes someone in the back will ask if they can forgive themselves. I tell them what was told to me in a holding cell that night. Forgiveness is not a single act. It's a practice. It starts with being honest, then with making the small, humiliating choices every day to be better. Will I ever undo the viral clips, the whispers, the shame? No. But I can try to be the kind of man who, when the hot blood hits, reaches for a phone to call a friend instead of a fist to make a point. That is my work now, small, boring, relentless. If that sounds pathetic, fine. I'd rather be boring and alive than dramatic and lost. Sometimes at night I drive past the street where she lives and my heart does that stupid animal thing. I don't knock. I don't call. I let the passers-by be the world they are. There's grief there, a lot of it, not just for a marriage but for a version of myself that broke things to get attention. There is also a sliver of gratitude, ugly and awkward, for the way consequence edged me toward accountability. The headline will always exist, man arrested after livestream altercation. But headlines are paper and human lives are not. I am not innocent. I am not irredeemable. I am late to the work and I will be late for the rest of my life, but I have started. And on the days the old blood remembers, I breathe, I call Diego, I read a page from the journal, and then I keep walking.